Good morning, friends, and welcome to Sunday Worship. My name is Reverend Dr. Nyaga from the diaspora. The title of our sermon is Plagues and Pandemics from Exodus chapter number 7 through 12. We will not read all the chapters on plagues, so I ask you to sit down somewhere and read the chapters for yourself and let the import of these chapters sink in. Many stories, evidence, and conspiracy theories have been presented to us about diseases in the past, without a singular, coherent, and concise message about the who, where, what, why, and how, and when of the tragedy we faced in terms of our individual and collective emergency response of staying healthy and safe. I say this because from the outset, the message about disease outbreaks must be both consistent and sincere. I strongly believe that people can handle good and bad news if the message from the authorities is clear and consistent. Diseases have ravaged populations over many centuries, with different results depending on what the cultural norms existed at that time, and most importantly, how authorities decided to handle them. The people have a right to be informed about percolating outbreaks precisely because the tools are there for this particular purpose. Pandemics, plagues, and epidemics fit well in a category of diseases that are infectious, highly contagious, and mostly deadly within days. It is just a matter of how widespread the disease becomes. Epidemics are often confined within a population in a community, within a region, while a pandemic crosses borders into countries and continents, leaving behind deadly results. According to the National Library of Medicine, pandemics cause distress, despair, death, and mayhem within families, communities, and nations across the board, as you all know. Pandemics do not discriminate between nations, geography, culture, or race. Pandemics travel through populations, infecting people by the air we breathe, contaminated water and food, or by the germs left on surfaces where transmission is by touching infected objects. Having said that, the parallels between our most recent pandemics and the plagues in the Old Testament are very clear. However, the difference between the plagues visited to the people in Egypt by God in the book of Exodus, 10 of them in fact, is that God was punishing the leaders in Egypt and its inhabitants for refusing to let the Israelites go free. Pandemics visited on us in this century were mostly expected and almost predictable to the T. Perhaps this is just pure speculation, but human beings may have caused or were complicit in the extent of the spread of diseases. All diseases originate from somewhere, somehow. In the most recent past, the following plagues were documented. First, the Athenian plague occurred in 430 BC, and its symptoms showed up in rashes, headaches, conjunctivitis, abdominal cramps, and hemoptysis, leading to death within 7 days. Second, the Antonine plague occurred between 165 to 180 AD. It is believed that soldiers returning from the war in the modern-day Iraq brought the disease back to Rome and as far as Germany during the reign of Marcus Aurelius. Third, the Justinian plague occurred in the year 541 AD. The plague was named after then Byzantine Emperor Justine. Other recent plagues or pandemics, if you like, were the 7 cholera pandemics which began in 1817 in India, spreading to Nepal, China, Japan, the Middle East, and parts of Russia. The present type of cholera began in 1961. Cholera started in Indonesia, spreading to more countries and continents than the other 6 just mentioned above. Cholera outbreaks are mostly due to water and food contamination and are ongoing as we speak. Hence, the latest cholera outbreak was reported in Somalia in 2021. Friends, that is just a capsule of plagues and pandemics as we know them, but as we focus on the 10 plagues visited on the Egyptians, keep in mind what the recent pandemics have taught us, and if we have learned anything, if at all. So, we are reminded that there were 10 plagues that were poured out onto the Egyptians during the time when the Pharaoh was adamant about releasing the Israelites from forced labor in Egypt. In the very first such incident, the water of Nile was transformed into blood. The water was stinking terrible to the extent that it became unusable for domestic purposes. The blood plague was the first plague that God directed as punishment to the Egyptians and their leaders for their disobedience. The following are the other 9 plagues, respectively, after the plague of the blood, notably the plague of the frogs, the plague of the gnats or mosquitoes, the plague of the flies. All 3 of these can be found in the 8th chapter of Exodus. The plague of livestock, the plague of boils, and the plague of hail. All 3 of these can also be found in the 9th chapter of Exodus. The plague of locusts and the plague of darkness can be found both in the 10th chapter of Exodus as well. The plague of the firstborn, which is the last one that we're going to talk about, is to be found in chapter number 11. The plague of firstborns was probably the most devastating because it ushered in what we call the Passover. God had promised to pass through Egypt, passing over, if you may, the houses marked with blood according to God's instructions. The Passover would happen on one designated night when God would strike down all firstborn men and animals alike. Each household of all Israelites was commanded to place a blood sign on the sides and on all door frames of their houses so that God's fury would skip these houses with the signs on them in order to spare the firstborns, both human and livestock. Dear listener, hold that thought for a minute. Let us take a quick gospel number break. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. As we just said a moment ago, the Israelites, through Moses, were given additional instructions about the procedures to follow when carrying out the defense outlined by Jehovah. God did in fact pass along in the neighborhoods, killing all the firstborns as promised, from the firstborn of Pharaoh to the firstborn of the prisoner and the firstborn of all livestock. You can see this in chapter number 12, verse 29. Those houses that God passed over were spared calamity. This is what got Pharaoh's attention, allowing the Israelites to escape Egypt. Pharaoh was afraid that the massacre would be visited on all his subjects in all of Egypt. God got Pharaoh's attention. Of course, the Israelites had their own problems in the desert once they were afraid, and the book of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua tell us how the story unfolded as the nation of Israel was taking shape. Friends, what we see in these plagues is God's anger and God's response to disobedience. We should not make mistakes. These plagues for all the disasters and the calamities when they are visited on us in our current world. Consequently, we should be careful when we invoke and assign blame to God whenever there is a disaster anywhere in the world, as purely a punishment from God. There is more to it. But also, we should be prayerfully seeking to discern and try to understand what it is that the disaster is telling us. Quite often, most disasters are man-made. Most of the calamities can be avoided if only we became more aware of how we steward the resources in the natural environment, knowing very well that we are only managers of God's creation, which we are all a part of anyway. My dear friends, we have set the table for a conversation on the plagues and pandemics, notably about the most recent coronavirus pandemic known as COVID-19. COVID-19 began its journey towards the end of 2019 from some place we will never know for sure. Information about its origin has been scanty at best so far. By October of 2019, many people across the globe had already started to experience signs of the disease. The symptoms of COVID-19 at that time included severe cough, sneezing, sore throat, headaches, and respiratory distress that went on for weeks non-stop. People tried all types of over-the-counter influenza and cold medicine with little success. I believe I was a victim of the early onset of the pandemic myself before it became widespread. I coughed for days on end. I tried to isolate even before isolation had become a thing. Fortunately for me, I had a place of isolation away from my family. For some strange reason, my cough went away after trying a plethora of concoctions from greens and roots and soup of everything. For those living in the US, the then president decided to downplay the severity of the pandemic. It took him 3 months to finally admit the extent of the severity of the virus. Even then, the president began buying into and propagating conspiracy theories whose aim was to deflect attention from himself and blame others for everything about the virus to make himself look good. Similarly, many other countries around the world became victims of conspiracy theories which had the effect of very slow and lackluster response. The consequences of buying the proverbial head in the sand, as we all know now, were devastating across the globe. The interconnected and interdependent world economy was brought to a complete standstill. People suffered unemployment, hunger, depression, domestic violence alongside the ravages of the virus. Churches were closed. People spent more forced time together at home for prolonged periods, which also suddenly came with unintended consequences unfamiliar to very many families, as we know. Now, the question I kept asking myself was what the church leadership had learned when God shut down all houses of worship worldwide. For me, I had this feeling that God may have been looking for a change in the ways we have been doing church business. Look, some of our very own clergy were up in arms asking the government to open houses of worship. I wonder if the churches have had time to reflect on what hidden messages God may have been sending to the world in the pandemic. Was it a punishment or was it a warning? What was it? Do you have any idea what God was doing during the pandemic when all the houses of worship were closed entirely? I still believe that God is angry with the world. The church has become a den of all kinds of mischief. It seems as if COVID-19 happened 200 years ago. We have forgotten, even though it has only been a year since we somehow came out of it. Friends, epidemics and pandemics will certainly come. There is a good chance that future epidemics and pandemics will be more severe, long-lasting, and probably more devastating worldwide. Due to a bad stewardship of God's natural resources, bad weather, heavy rains like the great floods in Genesis 6, hurricanes, wildfires, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, lightning, longer dark days, and uncontained diseases worse than the COVID-19 will be on the increase. I still believe that the church has not even begun to reflect on what COVID-19 was saying to us all, so loudly and clearly. I still believe that it is not too late to take an inventory of the latest coronavirus pandemic and prayerfully discern what the church should look like before the next one. Lord, open our eyes, our ears, and our minds in anticipation of the message in the plagues, epidemics, and the pandemics. Amen. Have a blessed day.